On 9/11, I was new to the Pentagon, had been there about 2 months, working as a lieutenant colonel, staff officer on the Army staff for the Chief of Staff of the Army. We were in a portion of the Pentagon that was under renovation. Our office, not far from Jamie's office, first floor, D ring, 451. I'll never forget the office number. And on that day, I was not in my office. I was at home moving into our house. And the move had been rescheduled twice. And I've often reflected on that, even though I started out that day a bit annoyed because everyone was in the office and I wasn't, because my move had been rescheduled. In fact, I thank God that there was some intervention and I was not there. Because from my desk down, everyone perished. And I'd like to share the story of my colleague, Lieutenant Colonel Bob Snyder, who was in the desk next to me on that day. When we were at our new home, our moving trucks were arriving, and we heard on the radio that there had been an attack. I called my office, and the answering machine kicked in. So I incorrectly assumed that everyone was fine because the phones were operating, when in fact the answering machines operate on a system far from the office. Bob was sitting at the desk when the plane struck the building. He had just left a meeting upstairs with our boss and looking at the scenes unfolding in New York. When the plane struck the building, the lights went out and he was knocked to the floor. And fortunately, he had one of these older World War II, we call them metal desks. And it was turned in a way that the desk was between him and the path of the plane. Or disoriented and seeing a huge fireball pass over him. The plane was full of fuel. I believe it was American Airlines Flight 77, just taken off from Dulles. The wings full of fuel. As it hit the ground and the wings fractured, the fuel spilled down the corridors as it passed through the E ring, the D ring, the C ring. And this fireball passed over Bob. And at that moment he said, I thought I was going to die. And then he put his arms over his head, he ducked under his desk. The flames passed over him. He received third-degree burns on his head and his arms. And then he says he looked up, though, and realized he wasn't dead. And now was the time to get out. But he was completely disoriented by the flame and the smoke. And then he heard a cry. And the cry was from a colleague, a coworker, a woman who had been in the office across the hall. And he said that cry galvanized him to action. Here was someone else, someone I could help. He moved to her, and he said seeing her and trying to reassure her gave him strength and hope that they would get out of this alive. And in fact, they started to move towards where they thought the outer wall was and eventually saw some daylight and made their way out. On 9/11, I will always think of Bob Snyder, someone who answered the call when the worst possible thing happened, and whose first instinct was to help someone else. On that same day, about 30 miles away, in a high school in Maryland, was a young man named Justin Davis. And he was 14 years old. And he was in junior ROTC in his high school. And on that day, his mother told me later, he became committed to joining the United States Army and defending his country. And 5 years later, he was in my brigade as we deployed to Afghanistan in 2006. This time, Private First Class Justin Davis. And Justin was serving in Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry. And they were positioned in a place called the Korangal Valley in the Hindu Kush Mountains in northeastern Afghanistan. One of the toughest places on earth, and certainly one of the toughest places you could ever fight. And they were taking the fight to Al-Qaeda, who had an enclave in that valley. On June 17th, Justin was killed. A year later, when I returned from Afghanistan, and visited Arlington Cemetery to visit the grave and meet with the widow of one of my other soldiers who'd been killed. I arrived early and was walking down the row of graves to get to my friend's grave, and I noticed, it was my first visit there, our war dead were buried chronologically. And in this row that had the body of my friend, one of my battalion commanders, were many of the dead from my brigade. So as I came to a headstone and recognized the name, it was a bit of a surprise, and I would stop and say a prayer. This happened 4 or 5 times. I got to a headstone, Private First Class Justin Davis. Next to the headstone was a blanket on the ground. And as I started to say my prayer, I saw a woman approach me from a few rows over, and she walked up to me, and I looked at her and said, are you Mrs. Davis? And she said, yes, I'm Justin's mother. And I looked at her and said, I was your son's commander, and I'm so sorry I didn't bring him home to you. And she hugged me at the time, and I remember thinking, I'm the one who's supposed to be comforting her, not her comforting me. And then she said, well, let me tell you about Justin. And she told me about him in junior high, in junior ROTC. When his country was attacked, his only thought of was stepping up and serving, and he couldn't wait until the day that he could enlist. And on that day, he came home, and he told his mother, Mom, today I enlisted. And she said, even though she knew of his desire, she was still surprised and shocked by what he had done. And she said, what do you mean you enlisted? What did you sign up for? And he said, I enlisted in the Army for the infantry. And she fell into a chair and said, the infantry? Justin, you're my only child. Maybe I can get you out of it. And he said to her, Mom, I don't want to get out of it. You know this is what I've always wanted to do, serve my country and defend my country. And besides, he said, don't lay that guilt trip on me that you didn't have more kids. And so at that moment, Mrs. Davis and I shared a laugh and the tears. And so when I think of 9/11, I think of Bob Snyder answering the call and helping someone else to make it out of that inferno. And I think of Justin Davis, whose dedication and commitment to our country, whose love of our country led him to sign up and volunteer and fight for our country. And he died doing what he wanted to do, fighting our enemies, taking the fight to them away from our shores. And because of his sacrifice and thousands like him, our country has never been attacked again. And that is something that all who have served and all Americans can be very proud of. And I think of these two individuals and hundreds and thousands like them. I'm reminded of two verses from the Bible, from the book of John. No greater love hath one than to lay down his life for another. And the book of Isaiah, chapter 6. And the Lord said, who shall I send? And Isaiah said, here I am, send me. And that's what they did. That's what our first responders have done. And that's what all who have served. And again, that's what PenFed is doing by serving those who have served. So thank you again for remembering this day and remembering all of those who served and sacrificed to ensure our freedom.